most painful thing about each and every one of them. I'll start off with Shelly and say that the most painful thing about her is when you get your super jumped over by an Edgar. Usually you don't make it out. The most painful thing about Nita is when you deploy your bear and you use the stun gadget, and then the enemies clear the way and you completely miss. You may call this a skill issue, but I have to say that the most painful thing about Colt is being able to hit all of his regular attacks but missing his very powerful super. The most painful thing about Bull is the fact that most other brawlers see him as a supercharge, and using him is still really hard to approach the enemies even if he has his super. The most painful thing about Brock is the fact that his super has 9 to 13 rockets, and sometimes you can still manage to miss every single one of them. The most painful thing about El Primo is the fact that usually you have to rely on receiving damage to fill his super. And believe me, that takes a while, but usually he has no other way to get up close to the enemies. Next up we have Barley, and I have to say that the most painful thing about him is when you're playing Heist and you get stuck playing defense. I mean, surely that's not fun for any brawler, but when you're using a thrower such as Barley, he needs to be pushing the enemy safe. The most painful thing about Poco is when you encounter an assassin. Because Poke is meant to heal himself and his allies, he's not always good offensively, and usually, he's seen as a very weak target to assassins. The most painful thing about Rosa is how hard it is for her to approach enemies. She has no evasive or speedy maneuvers, and she's very tanky, and as a result, she's seen as just a big, giant pillow for the enemy brawlers to shoot at. The most painful thing about Jessie is when you think you found a great spot for your turret, but then a thrower comes out of nowhere and tells you otherwise. I mean, when I'm loading into games, I'm usually hoping that there's no Dynamites on the other team. The most painful thing about Dynamite is that his default attacks seem to approach enemies like magnets, but as soon as I use a stun gadget, they completely miss. The most painful thing about Tick is when you finally fill up his super and you toss the head and you want to watch it chase someone down, but it ends up hitting something useless. In other words, anything that's not a brawler, I don't want the head to crash into. I have experienced this one far too much on my journey to the SYS 64738 title. The most painful thing about 8-bit is slow effects. I mean seriously, for 8-bit they're on a completely different level. The most painful thing about Rico is when you're doing all sorts of sweet maneuvers off the walls of the map and you're having fun, and then all of a sudden your favorite wall gets taken out. The most painful thing about Daryl is when you fill your super and you rush someone and they get away, and then you have to watch your attacks do like 300 damage per shot, but usually that does result from foolish moves. Now, this one's pretty much the same thing as Jessie, but the most painful thing about Penny is when you find a nice place for your mortar to go, and then a thrower appears and ruins the show. The most painful thing about Carl is when you send your attack and you get rushed before you're able to return your attack and get away with the flying hook gadget. The most painful thing about Jackie is when you use your constructing abilities to fix your net in Brawl Ball and then it gets destroyed again, watching all of your hard work disintegrate. The most painful thing about Gus is when you finally decide to be a good teammate, so you send the party balloon animal thing into midair and completely miss your teammate. The most painful thing about Bo is when you're trying to set the perfect trap with your mines and they end up hitting something useless like a Nita Bear or a Mr. P Porter. The most painful thing about Ems is when your attack only hits the enemy for one tick. This happens to me a lot with showdown boxes, and sometimes I don't even have to be standing on top of them. The most painful thing about Stu is the common dash catastrophe. Now, I may not be the best Stu player, but sometimes when you just can't get away from an enemy that you should have gotten away from is purely painful. The most painful thing about Piper is when you're able to hit all of your shots until the enemy is down to taking one more attack to be defeated. It's like once they're one shot, they're not getting hit anymore. The most painful thing about Pam is somewhat similar to Dynamite's, and that is when you're able to hit all of your regular attacks, but once you use a gadget, you completely miss. This usually isn't the best thing for her. The most painful thing about Frank is also probably one of the most agreeable, and that is getting your super cancelled. The most painful thing about BB is when you're up close to an enemy and you get your attack dodged. It's actually a very likely occurrence if you're facing a fast brawler, and when you swing and miss repeatedly, it's a complete nightmare. The most painful thing about B is when you charge your attack and you're feeling good about yourself, and then you miss the supercharged shot, and then that becomes an endless cycle. The most painful thing about Nanny is, well, crashing your super into a wall. I think you've all done it before. The most painful thing about Edgar is waiting forever for your super to charge, then using it, losing it, and not having it again. then you have to repeat. The most painful thing about Griff, and honestly, he's not doing that good right now. I think the most painful thing about him is anyone that deals a lot of damage. I feel like his defense is really weak right now, and anyone with a high damage output can take him out really fast. The most painful thing about Grom is when your attacks are constantly getting dodged. No matter how good you are, a better opponent might be able to dodge all of them. The most painful thing about Bonnie is after you use your super and take down an enemy, and you gotta wait for a while before you can go back into Clyde form. Technically, as I'm speaking, Hank is not released yet, but I'm gonna predict and say that the most painful thing about him is going to be, after you use your big charged up bubble, how are you gonna finish off the enemy? Are you gonna spam attacks? Are you gonna fill up a little bit? Like, what's gonna be the best combo? Alright, I could make a video out of this one alone, but I'm gonna go ahead and avoid complaining about Mortis for too long, so here's a clip of a Brawl Ball Mortis that did not take me long to find. The most painful thing about Kara is when you finally fill up your galaxy portal thing and then you completely miss. Just don't pretend like you've never done that before. The most painful thing about Jean is when you capture a rather dangerous enemy and it does not turn out well for you. Like, who would have known that an Ash could take down a Jean up close? The most painful thing about Max is when you use your teleported gadget and it just gets cammed. The most painful thing about Mr. P is watching all 3 little porters get taken out. I mean, my plan as Mr. P is to make an army of porters and take over, but it gets impossible when people destroy them all. The most painful thing about Sprout is when you box yourself in and you think you're safe, but then an enemy joins you in there and then you're not safe. The most painful thing about Byron is assassins. You've got to be kidding me. The most painful thing about Byron is assassins. The most painful thing about Squeak is when you use his wind-up gadget, and then you miss, and you have to watch the bomb go on forever and ever and ever. Like, literally forever. The most painful thing about Gray is reading the balance changes on January 12th of 2023. I mean, look at the size difference from his old gadget to his new gadget. The most painful thing about Willow is when you capture an enemy with mind control, and before you're able to finish them off, they don't...
Would you like to have healthier gums and